Before the 2015 earthquake that would shake Mount Everest to its core, there was one of the darkest days of the mountain's history in 2014, when a large chunk of ice broke away from the west shoulder and was a catalyst to the mother of all avalanches. In the early morning on Friday, April 18th, an entire climbing season would be disrupted as history would be rewritten on the most dangerous area of the tallest peak of the world. And those most affected are the ones all climbers rely on to reach the roof of the world, Sherpas. This is their story. Making the week-long trip to Mount Everest's base camp is no easy feat for the average person, as it is a constant 7 to 8 hours of trekking per day along with elevation change. But once climbers do reach camp on the south side, there is only one thing that everyone sees, and it has brought fear into the hearts of even the most experienced climbers: the Khumbu Icefall. To summit the mountain on the popular South Col route, you have to traverse the icefall that sits just 400 feet above base camp. This is important, as many climbers make their way through the glacier several times as they acclimate their bodies to the altitude before making a serious bid to the summit. Acclimatization is when a climber would climb to a certain point on the mountain, spend a period of time there, usually at one of the various camps, then descend back to base camp to rest. They would repeat this process, each time reaching a higher point before they are ready to make a summit push. But why is a glacier that isn't even near the death zone of 8,000 meters the most feared part of the climb? Well, the Khumbu Icefall is made up of small and large crevasses that have to be traversed by walking across a ladder, along with large chunks of ice called seracs that can break away at any point, wiping out anyone unfortunate enough to be below them. But the most dangerous part of the icefall is that the glacier is always moving. In fact, it moves roughly 3 to 4 feet per day, causing the route through the ice to constantly change. In a normal climbing season, many of the Sherpas would wake up early to evaluate, lay new guidelines and ropes through the established route as needed. I cannot stress this enough. Anyone summiting the mountain from the South Col route relies on these Sherpas every day, as they take on the bulk of the risk, spending the most time in the icefall. There is a reason that statistically, this is the deadliest part of the mountain for Sherpas. Those that do have to pass through the Khumbu Icefall try to do so as quickly as possible, as speed is the name of the game when traversing an always shifting piece of ice, especially when the average climber will pass through the icefall 6 to 8 times during their time on the mountain, while a Sherpa can pass through the icefall up to 40 times during a climbing season. I don't think there is any other stat that shows the discrepancy in risk Sherpas take on more than this one. In 2012, 2 years before the incident, some experts such as Hymex mountaineer Russell Bryce began noticing some ominous signs from the icefall. The route through the glacier typically leans towards the left side of the icefall, as this was the path originally established by Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary nearly over 60 years ago. The left side of the icefall just happened to be under some of the largest seracs on the entire mountain, some over 1,000 feet long, but it was the smaller pieces pointing to the unstableness of the ice, as climbers would watch during the day as chunks of them broke away and tumbled over the route. During the busiest points of the season, there would be 50 plus climbers during peak hours trying to traverse just under the ominous wall of ice, something Bryce was not comfortable with, and controversially, he would call off all expeditions to the mountain. This mainly upset his clients, who paid thousands of dollars for Bryce and his company to guide them up the world's tallest peak, but Bryce just couldn't bring himself to stomach the danger. 2014 started off no differently than any other climbing season. With hundreds of climbers receiving permits, it was set to be a busy year on the mountain, and there were high hopes around base camp leading up to the season, as the weather so far had been good. On Friday, April 18th, close to 100 climbers would begin preparing to set out on the Khumbu Icefall. There was no established route that morning, as a ladder had fallen out of place on a steep section of the climb, causing a bottleneck of climbers. This video, recorded that morning at 6:04 a.m., shows a team of Sherpas climbing an interconnected ladder, trying to continue setting the route through the Icefall, along with Kaji Sherpa explaining that this was his 5th time on the route, but he was feeling good that day, even with the difficulties. This was merely minutes before all of their lives would change. Mark Horrell, an experienced mountaineer and author, was one of these climbers preparing with his team to enter the Icefall, but they were lucky. As they made their way towards the ice, Mark and his team watched the disaster unfold right before them. At 6:45 a.m., a large chunk of ice, estimated to be 113 feet thick and weighing 31.5 million pounds, broke off from Everest's west shoulder, triggering the mother of all avalanches. The sound of ice and wind was like thunder, drowning out any noise, and quickly the entire icefall was covered by snow. Although it is reported as an avalanche, it was mostly ice chunks falling throughout the glacier, similar to a rockfall. 25 people were engulfed by the snow and ice, all of them Sherpas. Many were killed instantly, not because they were buried, but because shards of ice exploded around them, almost like a grenade blast, piercing their bodies with shrapnel. For those not killed, many were injured or buried by the snow, but there were a lucky few that were still near the entrance of the glacier and would walk away. This became Everest's deadliest tragedy at the time. Almost as soon as it happened, the noise and falling ice stopped. Then there was sound of life, people scrambling through base camp, climbers shouting over the radios, teams screaming at each other, preparing what gear they had. It was chaos, but it was intentional chaos. Some climbers would pack up their gear and leave immediately, noticeably shaken. The experienced climbers, Sherpas, and those that were already acclimated to the mountain began making their way to the Khumbu Icefall, but all Mark and his team could do was watch. Those that began the walk, which was only roughly 5 to 8 climbers, would enter into the icefall carrying ladders to reinforce the route, while others carried spades. 3 hours after the accident, the rescue helicopters finally began to arrive, and crowds, including Mark, would gather around the helicopter pads. Each climber that was found in the icefall would be carried by a litter or stretcher that dangled below the helicopter. It was an ominous sign for those waiting at base camp, as each time the helicopter approached, they did not know if they were carrying a body or someone who needed help, but there always was a dangling basket in the air. But unfortunately that day, most of the trips resulted in recoveries. In total, there were 9 Sherpas injured, 3 of which were critical, but all 9 would survive. 13 of those trips would result in a body being brought back to base camp. One of those being Kaji Sherpa, who was just on camera merely 30 minutes prior to losing his life. After 48 hours, the conditions had worsened, and the rescue team was worried about another serac potentially falling, so the rescue efforts would be called off, even though there were still 3 missing Sherpas, but they would never be found, and even to this day, their bodies still lie somewhere buried in the Khumbu Icefall. A total of 16 Sherpas would lose their lives, with 9 others suffering from injuries. It did not take long for critics to step forward, and there would be many controversies following the accident, mainly surrounding the Nepalese government, as they only offered $400 to all 16 families, which the Nepal Mountaineering Association dismissed out of disgust, as they felt it was a disrespectful offer for the risk that all the men took on. But it did start a dialogue in the mountaineering community, and even those not in the space began to take notice of the risk that Sherpas took. It became obvious rather quickly who the unsung heroes were. Most of the Sherpas would go on strike that season after being frustrated by the Nepalese government, essentially ending all climbs up the mountain unless certain demands were met. First, they wanted to be recognized for the poor conditions they were faced to deal with, and that steps would be taken to not only increase their resources, but also their protection and life insurance. The community also wanted the Nepalese government to pay $10,000 to all the families that lost their loved ones. For many of these families, their husbands, Fathers and sons were the sole providers for them, and losing a family not only devastated them emotionally, but financially. And while the $10,000 could not end their suffering, it could at least provide them some comfort. These demands also affected those climbers that had paid upwards of $50,000 to be on the mountain, and with no expeditions, they essentially would lose out on their money. While most of the climbers understood and felt sympathy for the Sherpa demands, they were still frustrated with the Nepalese government. Nepal finally agreed to pay the families the $10,000, and then another $5,100, bringing the total financial benefit for the surviving 16 families to $15,100. Additionally, the following season in 2015, the route through the Khumbu Icefall would be changed to focus more on traversing through the center, away from the large hanging seracs that may fall at any point. While it is not a foolproof fix, it is certainly a step in the right direction, but the terror of the glacier will never go away for those that take on the roof of the world.